Hopefully we've been working with the exercises from last week. So really, this is just a continuance of those exercises, really. So before we begin, we want to be in a different place. There's most likely a great deal that's accompanying us at the moment, our day, or merging into our day. And so I want to take this opportunity to be in a very different way. So let's begin with the preparation exercise. We want to hasten slowly through it and see if we can connect with all of our efforts over the course of the week, going back to the first session. So I find my posture. I adjust myself in my chair. Where am I? Just where am I? Is my head full of chatter? Is there something going on in my body? It's no judgment. I'm just trying to find myself. Where am I right now? Try to have my feet firmly but gently on the ground. My hips in the chair. My spine as vertical as I can get it. I'm trying to find this supportive posture. Something in which I can have minimal effort on the outside that might help me be more available on the inside. So I ask my body for help. So if I've been practicing, it might be a little easier for me just to slip into that posture. Still might need to adjust a little bit. That's okay. I'm always finding my way with it. I'm allowing my breathing just to find its natural place. Not trying to manipulate anything, but when the posture is more aligned, my breathing tends to follow it. So now I'm a little bit more ready. I already feel something beginning to come back in me. The day parking itself elsewhere. So, try to mobilize my attention and try to connect with the top of my head. Can I connect with the skin? Trying to connect with the sensations. Not trying to imagine anything. Just a very direct connection. I then try to bring my attention to the sides of my head. To the back of my head. To the forehead. Trying to sense the skin, muscles, that tingling warmth. Then try to sense the eyes, trying to soften the eyes, sensing the skin, then the nose, all over the outside and the nostrils, and on the inside of my nose. Every time I breathe, sense the air moving through the nostrils. I sense my lips, my mouth, the inside of the mouth, gums, teeth, tongue. If I can't quite make a connection, that's okay. I'm just trying. Then the jaw, the cheeks, then the ears, the lobes inside of the ears, and I come down into the neck, trying to sense the front of the neck, the sides, the back. I'm trying to stay soft, relaxed, but alert. I feel this struggle of a very different kind in me. I try to come in and sense the shoulders, all of the skin, muscles, and the chest, the upper back, middle back, lower back, the abdomen, trying to just let any tension go, but I'm trying to sense the sensations. And I sense the upper arms, elbows, lower arms, wrists, hands, and into the hips, sensing the seat, chair, then the thighs, knees, lower legs, ankles, feet, trying to sense my feet on the ground. And now I try to sense the whole of me as much as I can, the whole body from the top of my head all the way down to my feet. As much as I can. And then I let that go. So now I ready myself to sense my right arm. So I now move my attention into my right hand. Just a general sense, the skin, muscles. Trying to sense the palm of the hand, the top of the hand, then the thumb, up and down, and then each of the fingers, starting from the tips, up and down, and the webbing between the fingers. I have a sense of my right hand. Maybe my mind wanders on being taken away. That's okay. Every time I see that, my effort is to return again and again. And I sense my right wrist. Then my right lower arm, the front, the back, the sides, as much as I can, while being soft and relaxed, trying to elicit a free and available attention. And I sense my elbows, then the crux of the elbow, then the right upper arm, front, back, sides, then into the shoulder, all of the skin and muscles, joints. Then I move back down the arm, shoulder, upper arm, elbow, lower arm, wrist, hands. And now I try to sense the whole of my right arm, from the shoulder all the way through to the tips of the finger. Just this one impression, this one sensation. Maybe I can even have a sense of the relationship of my right arm to the rest of me. Then I let that go and I move into my right foot. I need to adjust my posture. I adjust. Again, I'm trying to say soft and supple, very alert. And I sense the top of the foot, bottom of the foot, the heel, and then sensing all of the toes individually. And the webbing between the toes. And I try to sense my right ankle. Then the right lower leg, the front, the back, the sides. Very gentle, yet firm. Then the knee, crux of the knee. Then the thigh, front, back, sides. Then the hips, the right hip, all of the musculature, skin, joint. How the hip makes contact with the seat. When I move my attention down my right leg from the hip to the thigh, knee, lower leg, ankle, foot. Now I try to sense the whole of my right leg from the hip all the way down to the toes as one piece, one impression, one sensation, as much as I can. And then I let that go. I then move my attention into my left foot. The top of the foot, bottom of the foot, heel, all of the toes, trying to sense them all individually. The webbing between the toes. Now I come up into my left ankle. And then into my left lower leg, trying to sense the front, the back, the sides. I begin to also have a sense of the struggle to sustain my attention. Then into the knee, crux of the knee, then into the thigh, front, back, sides. Then into the hip, trying to sense the skin, muscles, joints. The hip's contact with the seat. Then I move my attention back down my leg into the thigh, the knee, lower leg, ankle, foot. And now I try to sense the whole of my left leg from the hip all the way down to the toes. Can I have a sense of the life of my left leg? And then I let that go. And I now move into my left arm. Going to my left hand, trying to sense the palm of the hand, the top of the hand, all of the thumb, the fingers and the thumb, all individually. The webbing between the fingers. And then my left wrist. Then my left lower arm, trying to sense the front, the back, the sides. Then the left elbow, the crux of the elbow, then the upper arm, the front, the back, the sides, then into the shoulder, all of the musculature, the skin, joint. And then I move back down the arm, upper arm, elbow, lower arm, hand. And now I try to sense the whole of my left arm, from the shoulder all the way through to the fingers. And then I let that go. And I move my attention to the top of my head. Then to the sides of the head, sensing the front, the back of the head, and the eyes, nose, mouth, jaw, cheeks, ears, then the neck, trying to sense the front, the back, the sides. Then into the shoulders, the chest, upper back, middle back, lower back, stomach, upper arms, elbows, lower arms, wrists, hands, then the hips, thighs, knees, lower legs, ankles, feet. And now I try to have a sense of the whole of the body, from the top of the head all the way down to the feet, trying to sense as much as I can. And then I let that go. And we try to make an aim for today's session to see if I can keep a contact with my hands from now until the end. Can I sustain something as I speak, as I listen? Can I stay connected to the only tangible thing I can ever know, which is my body? So it might be, though there's no compelling, there's just an opportunity for maybe just sharing briefly some of the experiences that you may have had with the exercises. And there's no right, there's no wrong. There's just simply what was observed, what was described in my observations. If you don't have anything or nothing's been quite formulated, that's okay. Don't have to speak. It's an interesting exercise itself in trying to exchange on what one has observed as impartially as possible. This is harder than what it looks. So as I shared in the chat, what always surprises me again and again, every time I come to an exercise, that there's something in me that affirms it. I need to try this. A motivation, a wish, who knows where that comes from. But almost immediately there's something that resists in me. There's this struggle right from the get-go. So I find that an interesting question, just holding it there. Why this resistance? And it comes up in a myriad of forms for me. Could be a resistance in the body. I don't want to sit, or I don't want to try sensing my hand as I'm opening the door. There's something in the body that doesn't want to do it. Sometimes it's something in the feelings for me. I just, don't want to do that rubbish. Or I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it in my spare time. Or there might be something intellectually for me. Really? Do I really need to try this? Maybe there's something better. I'll go read a book instead and find something better than just to try it. So that it's just interesting to see that and not judge it. Not, oh, I'm a bad person or a good person. Well, that's rubbish. It's just what's there. And I just register it. So I was very thankful this week to have all that affirmed for me yet again, that all these things exist. All these things exist in me. So anyway, that's what I'd like to share.
So I would like to say that, for example, for the feet exercises, I was able to remember to set my feet when reading after maybe a while after reading. So I was able to keep that connection while reading, but I found somewhat difficult to remember about the opening the door. So that was because there was like a small moment. So maybe I opened that door, and then a couple of steps away from the door, I remember that I should have sensed that. So
Yeah.
that was curious for me because it was like after the event has happened, I remember that I should have felt it. So in the whole week, maybe 3, 4 times, I was able to actually remember to feel how to open the door. So yeah, that's what I would like to share, because for the other one, for the feed, what I was reading, it was like in a longer period of time. So I was able to come back to that continuously. But for the doors, it was more difficult.
Yes, and yes, I observe the same thing myself, and it's interesting. Quite regularly, I remembered after,
Yeah,
and there's something in that for me. There's somehow the movement of the body, while it inhibits something, it's also able to support something. So, so there's that question for me anyway. What remembers? What poked me after the fact that, hey, I wasn't there, but I could have been.
yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing I noticed is, I'm not sure what happened, but sometimes I could remember the sensation, but I'm not sure if that was the actual sensation or an imagination about what I should have felt.
Yes. Yes, and all of that comes up, just to stick with it. I find myself often I'll see something like that. Am I really sensing I I forgot? And for me anyway, how quickly it goes into, oh, Luke, bad person. Oh, I failed again. Oh, but not to allow oneself to go there. I just this is me. This is just me. And that's okay. I just need to see it. Yes.
I you said when we did this exercise in the beginning that shouldn't try to imagine, just have a direct contact when paying attention to the feet or whatever. And I think I've been misusing my imagination quite a lot when doing the exercise and going to the body, because I haven't been able to, notice it during the week. But when you said it, I think it's a struggle where I, through my imagination, can that I'm accessing, let's say, the palm of my hand, but then there's a subtle difference between direct contact.
Yes, and that's a good observation. Feel lucky you've had that, because I know for me, for a long time, I used to imagine connecting to the body until one day I did. And it was a completely different experience. But already, just in that observation, this imaginary part, as opposed to something direct. Wow, okay, I begin to see something. I begin to see how my imagination works, as to opposed to this very direct contact. So it's good. Hopefully you can see it again and again and again. Hopefully we all can. It's a blessing. It's a blessing. So okay. Yeah.
I'm happy to share unless Niels, was there anything else?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I noticed quite a big difference in how I could pay attention to different parts of my body, whether I was doing the directing internally myself versus you saying it, Luke, or my wife reading through it. So I had a lot more clarity when you or my wife was reading out the exercise. So that was one observation. I also have different parts of my body which have a different sense of quality of feel. So in particular, my feet, I could feel all of the different aspects of my feet, but I struggled with maybe my upper arms and different parts of my body. So there was just a different sense of what I could feel around my body. And then in terms of the feet, I go for a walk very first thing in the morning before I do anything else. And so I've actually been walking and returning to my feet, to the floor. So I felt that as a really useful kind of grounding exercise, and see how long I could pay attention to each step in the morning, which has been good. And then alongside that, I've been thinking, I've noticed actually I can pay attention to different things, like the sounds of birds and sight as well. So paying attention to different things simultaneously, which I've noticed, which has been quite cool this week. So they're the main things.
Yes. Yes, like everyone else who's spoken, wow, that's an incredible amount of material. It's interesting why it's easier to have someone else help you through the instruction, if you like, as opposed to me having to initiate it. There's a very interesting relationship that gets set up. If someone else coming from the outside helps me go through it, there's one relationship I have with the exercise. And then there's a very different one when I have to initiate it. So I'd leave it there, but there's interesting laws of relationship that can be explored just in that. And this sense of the body, I think like everyone, certainly for me, there's certain areas of the body which are easier to sense, or there's a different feeling about them. And so that observation in itself, I begin to have a different relationship with my body. Why is that? Why is it easier to sense the extremities? Or when I'm still, as opposed to when I'm in movement? What is it? And this other question of really, how do I listen? When I can connect with the body, maybe my listening is very different. Maybe my ears are just one part of the listening. It's said in the work, I can listen with the body. And if I can listen with the body, I can take in much more than just with my ears. So yes, there's a lot there. And trying something. I see something and I experiment with it a little. Yeah, I work with the feet, or I work with the hands, or it doesn't have to be with a door. It could be with the mouse of the computer. We have so much opportunity in life to exercise ourselves and to support something. So yeah, no, that's good. That's good.
In terms of my experience, if you're done here, can I speak? Yeah. I felt like the first day and a half, I felt a strong transmission from what you were teaching, and I could sort of feel you with me as I was doing it. And then it kind of faded throughout the week. It kind of disappeared, and I became myself again and kind of lost it. There was a kind of a joy sort of at the beginning. Well, I noticed, the other thing I noticed, that the feeling the electricity or tingling in my feet, kind of enjoying it. Like there's a joy when you're doing the practice, and there's kind of an unhappiness when you're not. There's a general sense of unhappiness, and I oscillate between not just these practices, but the other practices I do. I oscillate between, when I do them, almost it's a guarantee of some kind of joy, even if it's hard, right? It's almost a guarantee of joy. Whereas if I don't do them, it's almost a guarantee of misery. It's almost like that clear, right?
Yeah.
And then, so why don't I do them? And that's kind of the question.
Yes, and yes, they're my questions. There is something about consciously wanting to engage, some alchemy that happens in us. That if we don't do, it takes something away from us. And going to your first observation, Andrew, yes, this sort of comes into the question of how we influence and support each other in work. That how things can transmit is very interesting. I won't go into it now, but it really goes to the cornerstone of what it means to work either in a group or work with others, something very interesting goes on. It's yeah. Mm.
I'd like to add to that. So I've been doing this exercise for years now. So I know as soon as Luke names an exercise or something as simple as that, I'm like, oh, I have to be conscious now. I have to put more effort. And, my mind races through these all states of desiring to go back to sleep, whatever that means. But I also know what you're sharing, Andrew, that feeling of, I'm aware that inside the trying, I feel more alive. I feel that I'm inside like a state of integration, as subtle as it is. I'm more available to like who I am and this exterior world. So I was in a situation that I put myself in as usual, and it was like full of enormous tasks, and that I knew it would take months and months and months to complete, physical labor. And there was incredible emotion attached to the tasks. And overall, I have this sort of strong aim to strengthen my will. So I'm standing there with this enormity of what's before me. And then something prompts me, like, to remember both my feet and my hands. But it was this feeling of, oh, there you are again. Like now these exercises had become part of absolute consciousness or something, but it made me feel very grounded in the present. And I no longer felt this weight that I had conjured up inside my mind, which was very real. But I thought, well, if I keep assuming I can't do it, these tasks and this vision and what have you, like my body stiffens up, it just becomes impractical. And I thought I have to just hold this sensation of my feet and hands, even just for a moment. And so there's this person talking to me, and there's all this stuff. And the smell too, the smell is very difficult to bear. But being in that like time, felt like I was entering a moment in time. I felt confident and in service. And so I was just inside this place of gratitude that these exercises seem to be, the word simple, they're so simple, but they open up so many dimensions inside me. And this is why I've been in the work for so long. It's like, and I don't know many exercises. I only know a few, and they're enough to sustain so much of my life. And now I've come to understand that those moments when I have them, they help me survive. Like they keep me experiencing myself as greater than something really small and egotistical and all this other stuff. But so I just want to share that there's something very beautiful about the exercises, even though there's deep struggle. And the other thing about being in a group is that, like, Luke's like an imaginary friend, you know. Luke comes with me so many places. And so it becomes something like the exercise is there, then there's association with the work, and then there's association with Luke, and there's this kind of melody occurring or what have you, that, but it flows like a river. And then depending on which part of this river I choose to consciously sort of ask for more strength. And so if I think of Luke, I think, oh, that's going to help me even more. So I just feel like it's also very organic, like the process of what the exercises become inside you. My feeling center is very strong, and so I'm always talking to myself, telling myself, like, be more logical, you know, think more, that, you know, stop feeling. And anyhow, then I kind of throw all that out once I just remember, like, just to not be so overcritical and just, yeah, allow myself just to be. And it's so difficult, but anyhow, I'll stop talking now.
Good, good. And thank you, everybody, for sharing that. That sharing will go a long way. Okay. So last week we touched on sleep and awakening. And we're sort of just starting to touch on sex and soul, which there seems to be a lot of loaded meanings with. But my aim is to try to outline this as best as I can in a relatively simple way, what Gurdjieff was attempting to get to, though there's a lot in this. But what I found very helpful with Gurdjieff is that he very much approaches this as matter of fact and tries to remove all of the fantasy around it, which there's a great deal, particularly in our modern world. There are some things just through the material I'll move through relatively quickly because it's needed to be there for completeness, to have a sense. But like last week, invite questions at any point and any clarifications or anything else, or whether we wanted to concentrate on something. But I've probably found for me this to be a very great help to get a sense of an orientation, but also to have a barometer for my own work. And this is important in the Gurdjieff work. I need to have an aim, a wish. I need to be working towards something. And with that, I need to have some type of metric, if I use modern words, some type of measure of whether I'm moving towards that aim or whether I'm moving away from it. So it's not enough just to try things. It's trying with a sense of, where am I heading with this? And this is, I found, to be the most kind of difficult aspect of anyone's spiritual journey, Am I on the right path, a healthy path, my path? All of those sorts of questions. For time waits for no one. So, what is the soul? Well, that's in one sense not so easy to put forward. But one of the things which was important for Gurdjieff was that we're not born with a fully formed soul. This idea seemed to have crept into, particularly in the Christian consciousness, somewhere, I think, 600 or so years ago. But it's not part of the biblical teachings. This sense of everyone has an immortal soul that we're born into. For Gurdjieff, no, we're born with one in potential. We have a seed, if you'd like, a potentiality for one. And in a way, the aim of human life is to develop something, this soul. Sometimes I've found it helpful to use another word, and probably in the more secular language, the word maturing is probably getting towards this idea of soul that Gurdjieff talked about. And this word maturing is very interesting. We use it. And it's not used in the sense of anyone being smarter or more emotionally attuned or older. There's something we can't quite put our finger on. You know, it's like a fine wine or a good cheese. What is this process of maturing? What does it mean? It doesn't speak to one part. It seems to speak to the whole of it. So in a way, I found it helpful to maybe look at this lens through the word of maturing. And that gives a little bit more of a sense of where Gurdjieff points to things. And again, very matter of fact, this maturation process is important. And we acknowledge some of it, but we may not acknowledge other parts of it. And right from the outset, Gurdjieff talks about that there are some parts of the soul that form automatically. For example, the physical body. It has been imbued with a natural process of maturation. But also that there are other parts which are up to us, other parts that need to be formed more consciously, because they can only be formed consciously. That is, with our participation in the process. Which also means that we don't have to participate in it. And if that's the case, then it's left up to forces greater than ourselves in terms of where that goes. So basically, what is a soul's purpose if we put it into a bit of a matter-of-fact statement? Be an effective, conscious and creative instrument of God's will. And I use the word God, and maybe we can look at that a little bit further next week about what that means, because that also has a great deal of loaded meaning. This helper in sustaining the world. So this is interesting. So in a way, the earth has been seeded with life, and particularly we humans. And there's parts of it that help us to grow into something, and then also requires our participation to grow into this helpful instrument, whatever that means. But there's a real sense that it takes on a myriad of forms. myriad of forms. And more importantly, our own unique way to be effective, conscious, and creative is unique to us as an individual. So in a way, we need to find out what that means for us. There might be some general principles, but at the end of the day, your path is your path and no one else's. Your work is your work and no one can do it for you. There's a saying in the work that while we cannot do anything, without us, it cannot be done. So I just wanted to briefly touch on what this idea of will is. And again, speak to this a little bit more next week. So there's something interesting, and we've all touched upon it, sharing our experiences. What is this realm of effort? What does it mean to make an effort? From a chemical point of view, an anatomical point of view, effort should be relatively easy. Once a chemical reaction in us is initiated, it goes, as they say, like clockwork. And yet, when we make an effort, there seems to be something that is brought into my working, brought into this process that changes the functioning or the direction. And we see this practically when we just begin to experience these elements of our consciousness called intention, attention, and sensation. There's a very interesting saying, I need to pay attention. I need to pay attention. It means that when I attend to something, there is a transaction that's required, a demand, something brought into the equation. If not, then it's not conscious, it's just automatic. So when I pay attention to my feet, to my hands, to my body, in that moment, I set up something very different in myself through this thing we called effort. So I just wanted to highlight that this idea of effort, this question of effort, is a mystery in one sense. How do I even make an effort? Where does this effort come from? And it's not from the physiology. It seems to come from somewhere else. So for Gurdjieff, and despite some of the material that's in Ouspensky's records of Gurdjieff's material in his book presents this in a very different way, though very much related and very much aligned. So what is a soul? So there's the lower part of the soul, the physical body, the material body, what we see, hear, touch. This thing, which I find always very interesting. I can remember when my son was very young, he was in his high chair and I happened to be there at the moment where he realized he had hands. I could remember his little face going, what are these? But for a moment he became cognizant that he had a body, that he had these instruments, and he was fascinated by it, absolutely fascinated. which was great because that was able to occupy him for some time. But we're given a body. We didn't make it. We didn't create it. We didn't order it. It is provisioned for us. That by itself is very interesting. Where did it come from? Yes, we can talk about genes and our parents, but really, we don't have a clue. We are provided with a body, provided with this lower part of the soul, this instrument, this supportive framework, however you want to call it, this chrysalis that allows something else to take place. If we could really appreciate that our body is not ours and that it was provided for us, a gift, that would change everything. As I said, what can be perceived generally through the sensory organs, functions. So functions of thought, functions of feeling, functions of movement, instinct. All of these things are actions that play out into the world that we generally see. And then there is the middle part of the soul, the Gurdjieff body, or sometimes referred to as the astral body. Gurdjieff in Old Persian means vessel of the soul. It is the container for something else, or at least can be. The Gurdjieff, or the astral body, this middle part of the soul, is the development of new organs of perception within a different body. That all arises from this subconsciousness, what we spoke of last week, as what Gurdjieff would say is our real consciousness. And the consciousness that we normally experience and interact with others on is really just a thin film, if you'd like. A user interface for the world. It's important, but yet there is a whole ocean of consciousness that we generally never see or get access to. It might pop up every now and again, but we don't consciously move towards it. If anything, in our more sleep-like state, we tend to run away from it because it's so powerful. This is the infrastructure of being. And part of that infrastructure that we can begin to connect to, that can maybe lead us back into this subconsciousness, this real consciousness, this middle part of the soul, is the sensations of the body. And one of the reasons why that is because it's our most ancient part. Sensations are primitive, primeval. They're pure, they're raw. And if we can make a connection with it, there is an opportunity to filter out some of the guff that comes through just with the mind or emotions. There is a way in, if you'd like, that can include everything else, but we can tether ourselves to, connect with. And if that can be developed, some of these new perceptive organs, in modern day parlance, is like ESP or intuition or the sense of conscience. Everything that's kind of buried within us can begin to be connected to, refined, and grown. I mentioned earlier that we can listen in a new way. When we listen only with the lower part of the soul, it's just with the ears. When we can begin to listen with the middle part, we can listen with the whole body. The sensations can act as a new organ of perception. I can begin to see things in a different way, little bit by little bit. And then Gurdjieff calls the higher part of the soul, the higher being body, which is, if you like, the prize or the ultimate goal or outcome for humans. Maybe even all of life. Language tends to fail when we talk about this, though Gurdjieff talks about it in many, many different ways, but probably a way that might make a little bit more sense, though religious very much in tone, is this higher part of the self can connect to its source, can become the instrument of the source's will, of God's will. That is, I can become more aligned with what's naturally alignable. I'll only do one quote from the Bible here, but this is a very interesting quote from St. John. On that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. This saying of Christ, and indeed it comes up in many other scriptures about this will, that it doesn't relate to being or function, but somehow relates to this question of alignment. So, Andrew, you spoke earlier of feeling something, that there was an experience from that session or an action that was felt in you, and certainly I feel it. I've been wonderfully carrying everybody with me for the last week. There's some sense that when our efforts are aligned and we're working towards something in our own way, there's something that happens in this realm of will, sometimes called the spiritual realm, but there's something that happens behind the scenes that helps us all in ways which are very difficult to put into modern language, simply because our language doesn't have the capacity with which to elucidate it. Something we might come back to, but very important. So there's these three aspects, all interpenetrating us. So we're not just the body. There's this nascent middle part, nascent higher part. It's there. It just isn't coming to the surface yet. Just not coalesced yet. Before I go on, are there any questions? We're just happy that we just continue. Okay. So maybe just one other comment with being able to differentiate these parts is that quite often in our modern world, and certainly with science, it treats everything as homogeneous. Where for Gurdjieff, being able to identify and experience these various parts is critical in being able to help them integrate. And so this is this strange process, this strange ecology that we need, in a sense that we need to be blown apart, because that is the way that we can begin to integrate ourselves back again. So I'll just be talking about some of the processes of soul formation, but just right from the get-go, there's just some concepts that can be verified in your own experience, and this is important. If they remain as concepts or ideas, they'll always be very distant. So part of the work, part of the hard way, is how do I verify these things within myself? And they're just some. So for Gurdjieff, everything is material. Everything, if you'd like, is energy. Everything is something that can be experienced in some way, shape, or form. And we need to experience it. We need to see it from the outside. And more importantly, we need to see it from the inside. So gravity is a good example. I'm sure that we all know conceptually that the jump off a building because of gravity will probably harm us. But also we can experience gravity within, and we even talk about it in our language, the gravity of the situation. There is a force that enters into a situation, both outwardly and inwardly. Something that can drag us down, pull us down, but we have this sense of a force acting in us. The law of seven, or the law of heptaparaparshionok, as Gurdjieff would put it, this law of process and aspect, this law of movement in us. And we can begin to verify some of these things in practice. And we've already, in a way, touched on it. Why right at the beginning is something easier to do. I can remember better. There's a more energy there. And then after a time, something dissipates. Why is that? At other times, I know that it's going to be hard, so I enlist support. Maybe I phone a friend. Maybe I go to church, or I go to a group meeting, or I come to some strange online course. But somehow that helps me. It enables me to move through something. So innately it's there. It just may not be fleshed out more consciously. So again, something we need to feel inwardly and also very much see outwardly. The law of three, the law of triamasicano, that there is something in me that I can experience. I can experience my resistance. I can experience my affirmation. Can I also experience what reconciles in me? And the more I can experience this relationship of resistance and affirmation, reconciling, and see it in as many situations as I possibly can, in relationships, in business, the more I can see it, the more maybe I get a sense of my own law of three and my own law of seven that operates within me. To the right of this screen is Gurdjieff's famous Enneagram. A very curious symbol, mathematically very interesting, but maybe for another course. But also what this Enneagram shows, and we'll talk about this a little later, is these what's called conscious shocks. That there are places in me, times in me, relationships that get established in me where something is needed. And only something that I can give to myself. There is another movement, the Hanel Miatsnel, which is a Gurdjieff strange word for the differentiation of something higher and lower in me blending. And to feel that there are energies of a higher nature that when they come in, also very quickly move to lower parts in myself, but create something in the middle. So it can be, for example, that I'm feeling a bit lonely, a bit depressed, I lack energy, and then I come to something, maybe to a course, or again, I speak to a friend, or I read a passage, and something of a higher quality comes in and blends with it. And all of a sudden, I'm just ever so slightly lifted up. Not to the higher states, but I've moved a little in myself. So these things are all important to begin to experience in life. In life.
Luke, can I interject quickly? I understood everything you said except for the idea of the Enneagram related to shock. Can you explain that a little bit, or?
Yes. So in the Enneagram itself, I'm assuming everybody can see it on the right-hand side. But around the outside of the Enneagram, the circle, there is a movement that very much aligns itself with the law of 7. So each of those points, as I move around the circle, as a process is undertaken, there is a movement of energy. So let's maybe take last week. So last week we had the first session, which is really that first note or two, the first couple of points around the Enneagram, around the outside of it. And then with the Enneagram, with this law, it says that after a while, that will dissipate. Generally, when it gets to that point where the triangle on the inside intersects with the circle on the outside. And it says that this point, that while there is a process happening in me that is winding down, there is a point where that Enneagram, or where the triangle meets the outside of the Enneagram, where a shock is needed. Otherwise, the energy will completely exhaust itself. There needs to be something fresh to come in. And in this case, it's this session. Something lifts it again, and I have the ability to carry on for another week. I've been renewed somehow. Some fresh energy has come in from our collective efforts. And then the law says, going around the outside of the Enneagram, that right down the bottom, where this big gap is, the Anel Ahut, as Gurdjieff would call it, there comes to this strange place where I don't know how to move forward, but I also know that I can't move backwards. I've gone too far. I need to keep on moving. And so there's something that needs to happen there. Something that needs to be renewed. Maybe, for example, I put into question, why am I even doing this? Why am I trying this? Maybe it's the third session of the course. Maybe I call someone, maybe I read a book, but it's something that I try to find that affirms or tries to create a way forward, because I don't know. I'm in between. I'm stuck in the middle. And then if I can move forward, which generally requires an effort of will to just keep going, I then come to this other place in the triangle where another shock is needed. Otherwise, the energy will dissipate. So what this Enneagram begins to represent is that if I can understand that in any event or any situation or any relationship, that I'm going to come up against something, a resistance, a loss of energy, a loss of motivation. And if I can anticipate what I need when that comes about, and then inject it in there, or provide the conditions with which that injection becomes possible, I'm then able to keep on moving in the direction that I originally wished for. But what normally happens in life is everything becomes its own opposite because I'm not cognizant that these things are going to happen. I start off wanting to save the world with a great deal of energy and end up warring with everybody. I enter a relationship saying how much I love you, and by the end of it, I want to punch you in the face. We've missed something. Something along the way, something in that journey, I've been blinded. And so it goes only the way that it can. So to approach something more consciously is to anticipate some of these challenges and what might be needed. This is difficult because I need to have these experiences of how things go wrong again and again and again before I begin to understand maybe how they can go right. Does that meet your question, Andrew?
Yeah, that's extremely helpful and interesting. Thank you. I have a little bit of a question still lingering about the nature of shock.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and that's coming up in a moment, Andrew. I wish to speak a little bit more about that. Yeah. And then just gently these two movements of energies of what Gurdjieff would call evolution or conscious evolution and involution, that there is always flowing in me something that is needed to be expressed, created. But there's also another current that I'm generally very unaware of that is trying to consciously evolve, go the other way. So there's something always trying to come out of me, and then there's something that's always trying to come into me. But in a sleep-like state, everything comes out, very little comes in. When I'm slightly more conscious or awake, stuff can still come out of me, but there's just more coming in to enable more going out. So in one mode, one automatic sleep-like state, the world chews me up and spits me out. In another way, I can use the world neutrally as it uses me, so that potentially I can forge a third world, my own soul. So I just very quickly, I come back to my body again. I come back to my posture, just very quickly. Where am I? Trying to sense my feet, my hands, my body. Okay. So for the next little section, I'll just move through a bit more quickly as again for completeness. But again, if there's any questions or clarity, I'm happy to look at that. This is very much an interest of mine. But I think it's important to have a bit of a grounding in it. So the three foods, soul nutrition. Oops, my computer is not waking up. There we go. Okay, so for this lower part of the soul, the physical body, It very much follows textbook anatomy and physiology. Something that I used to teach at one of the universities here, and which really got me, if you like, a bit hooked into Gurdjieff because of its integration with some of the other things that we'll be talking about. But I just wanted to mention that this lower part of the soul, this ordinary food and drink that we have, that it has an equivalency or a correlation with states of matter, which is interesting. There's states of being and there's states of matter. There is a correlation. It is molecular in nature. That is material stuff. Can only survive a few weeks without food and a few days without water. So it goes into that the lower part of the soul is fairly robust. It's been around for at least a couple of billion years, and so it's been worked on quite well. The middle part of the soul, as Gurdjieff would say, is fed by air. Air is very interesting, and particularly the way that it is recorded in Ouspensky's between what is called the hydrogens, the oxygens, the carbon, and also nitrogen. I won't go into that, but very interesting. But air, again, is another state of matter. When air enters us, it ends up being in an ionic state. That is, air mixes with us in a charged way, an electrically charged way. Interesting. We can survive only minutes without air. So when we move into this food for the middle part of the soul, we're now moving into something that has a very different tempo of regulation. The body can survive longer. Middle part of the soul cannot survive as long without its food. And then the higher part of the soul, fed by, Gurdjieff would call impressions, which is speculated to be electrical, magnetic in nature, quantum in nature, but most importantly, for those scientists in the room, it's massless. It is literally light. Impressions are light, both an inner light and an outer light. And what's interesting, Gurdjieff says, without impressions, there is no survival. It is instant death. So again, there's these tempos that operate in us in each part. We don't normally dwell or think too much about impressions because they're always there. Air, we don't think too much about either because the atmosphere is always there until it's not. And it's the same with food and drink. So there's this interesting relationship with the nutritional aspects of myself. So when we take in and try to digest these foods, ordinary food and drink is essentially just the standard textbook approach that Gurdjieff says. We take in stuff, it gets broken down and then begins to enter the body once it goes across from the stomach area and then starts to move into the bloodstream, which only then is it inside the body. Otherwise, as it's moving down the alimentary canal, it's technically still outside of us. We haven't absorbed it inside. So this is interesting. We need to break things down into its constituent parts before it can be integrated into the body. And of course, this blood flows into the cardiopulmonary system, where air comes in via the mouth, and for Gurdjieff also via the skin, which is also true. And once this air mixes inside of us, mixes in with the blood, this more purified blood now, there's something that very interesting happens. Blood itself is an interesting connective tissue, and it's defined as a connective tissue, literally, in anatomical terms. For Gurdjieff, it is the blood that links the body with the feeling states. He also talks about another blood, the Hadblenzoin, which then links our consciousness to our feeling states. So air is very interesting in terms of it's at a higher energy level that's able to integrate into the body. And then as we touched on these impressions that are coming from the inside of us, everything that we sense, everything that intuits in us, images as well as everything that we would say comes from the outside. So all these impressions, in a way, are coming into us and in a sleep-like state are all mixed up. And so part of this work, in a way, is can I begin to experience these energies? What is really coming from the outside and what is really coming from the inside? In modern psychology, it is normally pushed that everything is in your head. Well, I question that. When one begins to experience some of these energies, yes, undoubtedly, there is something that comes from the inside, from me. There is something that comes from just the outside, physical world. But there's also something that can come in that's not me. So to differentiate all of these things is important. And again, follows that theme of something needs to be differentiated before it can be integrated or simultaneously integrated. All these impressions are mutually transformed. It's certainly for the body, electrochemical, and in the electrical and magnetic spheres, also for various parts of the soul. So the electrochemical stuff, if you know a little bit about neuroscience, very much serves the infrastructure of the nervous system, what we would call neurons and neuronal networks. And the electrical magnetic side, the photons, light, this massless side of it, services the infrastructure of the soul. So again, there's something very interesting, very resonant about light as we would normally understand that through science, but also saying that science understands very little of light, even though we can manipulate it very well. But also this inner light. And often that the metaphor of light is spoken about in scriptural terms. But for Gurdjieff, it's quite a tangible thing. It's literally talking about light, but its inner aspect rather than its outer. And just something I wanted to raise, there was someone who I respect, Dr. Keith Buzzell, in his books, which he very much goes into some depth around the science of light and consciousness and attention. And maybe for some further study for yourselves, it speculates that the EM patterns are associated with the contents of consciousness. That is, there is some holographic imaging, if you'd like, that is able to superimpose itself on our nervous system. But it's the force of light itself that is associated with what Gurdjieff calls will and attention, or Enki Danok. That there is some inner aspect of this substance that we call light, which is associated with will, attention, and the entire workings of the universe. But I'll leave that as more of a question and for further study. So with all that, with this physiology and process, which in Gurdjieff's day wasn't so much grounded in science, but now there's much more that lends to the efficacy of what he said through science. We now move into these, what we spoke of earlier, these conscious shocks. That is, there is something that we need to do in order to enable a process in oneself. If I don't do it, things just go along automatically. Things just go along in sleep. You're rolling the dice. If the conditions are good, then it's all good. If the conditions are bad, then it's all bad. But I don't participate. So probably maybe something that you're familiar with in Gurdjieff's work, self-remembering, which is the attempt to consciously create a habit to connect my parts. In terms of the formation of the soul, this connecting of my parts helps to keep the evolution or the upward movement of the food of air and impressions going. If not, I'm just the body, dust to dust. But if I can keep something in me, connect and relate, then there's another process that is enabled. So like with the preparation exercise, like with working with sensing the feet or sensing the hand, there is a demand that I make on myself to constantly try to connect my parts. And initially, that connection is paying attention to the sensations of the body as impressions arrive. So I need to be in a connected and a collected state, so that as impressions come in from the outside or the inside, they can find their rightful place in me. And then something can happen of its own accord. Something can move in me in a different way. So my first work is, can I establish this process in the course of ordinary life? Not when I'm in a cave or I'm on a course, but in life. It needs to start, for example, in the preparation exercise, something, but I need to continually move that experience and that effort into life. Can I connect with a part of my body or all of my body when I'm doing something at work with my family? And I increase this connection little bit by little bit, allowing something else to enter. This takes a long time, some years. But if I persist with it, something will begin to form of its own accord. Something attracts something to itself. Because this process of connecting, just generally, is very healthy. Once this can become more established in me, then the second conscious shock comes in. Gurdjieff alludes to this a little bit in the Uspenskian record, but also much more in Beelzebub's and other writings, but in a bit more of a obtuse way. But this self-feeling is being able to consciously relate the energies. And what I mean by that is one way to enable that in a more wholesome way, is this sense of one's own nothingness. This is the harrowing part. That I begin to see that as I try to self-remember, I begin to see it's possible, but I also see very clearly that most of my life is spent in self-forgetfulness. I'm asleep. And that can dig down to something very much deeper in me. And when I can have a sense of this nothingness, this what am I? What am I if I'm not here? What am I if I'm just pushed and pulled at every moment? What am I if I'm just a ball of reactions? What am I? This can begin to touch on those feelings that sometimes is called piety, humbleness. I begin to have a very different valuation of myself, and also a sense that I need a great deal of help. And after a time, I need to be able to consciously feel this and not run away from it, not shirk it, not absolve myself into a whole bunch of things that distract me, but I'm there with it. So these two conscious shocks, which are shocks I can give to myself, I need to be able to understand them intelligently. And to come to the second one, I need to be well grounded in the first one. That's part of the filtering. Because if we just went straight to the second one, as some people try to do without a balance in the first conscious shock, then all sorts of things can go awry. And then there is a third conscious shock, but I won't speak about that today. But there's something else that you're unable to give yourself, and it must come from some other place. So these shocks, I just need to understand as part of this creation of becoming more integrated and more whole. There will be times where I need to be active and work, and other times that I just need to be with it, to endure it until something else can emerge. But for a long time, it's just working with the first conscious shock, which is important and something that one works with for one's entire life. Is there anything in there, Andrew, that you wanted to say? Or
Maybe I'll just leave it for the moment.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll come up again, my thought here.
yes, and I would have to say this is the most ill-understood aspect of Gurdjieff's system. Mainly because it's very hard to fully encapsulate in a book what this means. You simply must go through it yourself. You must work with it and work with it. And you'll understand it for yourself, and no one will have to tell you. You'll know. You'll know what it is. So in a sense, Gurdjieff's work, or the hard way, is a way of self-initiation. Just got to do the work. So we've spoken about the physiology and the nutritional component, which is in relation to Gurdjieff's law and Enneagram is an upward movement and ascending octave, as he would say. There is also the octave that goes the other way, the descending octave, which is an octave which comes from somewhere up high and moves down through us. Part of this movement down is what is called the eliminations. So the first elimination, which corresponds to the physical body, is the normal excretion of feces and urine and other things. We all know you ingest food and the waste materials need to come out of you. Otherwise, it can cause all sorts of health implications. So there's a natural understanding of these movements. What goes in must also come out, or at least a part of it. The body can absorb some and use it, but there's quite a bit that also just needs to be ejected from you, and it can be used elsewhere. So these movements, which comes back to those other slides around the basic concepts and being able to experience them in practice, there is a whole series of exercises in just being able to sense and experience taking in food and going to the toilet, and experiencing really going to the toilet and what that means for the body, something we seldom do in the modern world, but it can really open up a wealth of material, because as Gurdjieff says, it's completely analogous to the other aspects of the soul. Which then comes to the second elimination. So these are some of the waste products of the middle part of the soul, and Gurdjieff has a whole physiology around this, which I've touched on, but really requires much more in-depth exploring on its own. But this is the regulation of the sexual function. In one way, sex, the act of sex, or merely the process of this energy moving through the act of sex, is a regulatory action. And this expression of sexual function will be unique to everyone. The difficulty is being able to differentiate normal, healthy expression of that sexual function, which might mean maybe you need to have sex every day, or twice a day, or once a week, or 3 times a year, whatever that is for you. Something healthy as opposed to something that's artificial. And when I say artificial, something that is stimulated by fashion, such as pornography, or as such some cultural kind of baggage, or something within the community that is stimulating you to express sexually, which really goes against the grain of your own natural sexual function. This is not anything that anyone can tell you. You need to work with this yourself. What is it? How does this expression of sex in me arise in me naturally, as opposed to being stimulated in me? That by itself can lead to a genuine insight and work on your own sexual function. But in our modern world, where we're saturated by all sorts of things, as I said, fashions, is people tend to adopt them at the expense of what their own natural expression is. So that's an interesting work in itself, and certainly in my case has been very surprising. The third elimination is this rejection of impressions. So just as we can eat bad food, we can have bad impressions come in. That can pollute us. And Gurdjieff talks a great deal about not polluting our 3 brains. is a ransom keeper, being very watchful of these pollutants that enter us. And it may not always be what you think, but anyway. Gurdjieff says that this is connected to the energy of imagination, or pienjahari, which is part of the physiology of all of this. And very much connected to breathing, which is interesting. And I'll just note that when it comes to all sorts of anxieties that come from who knows where, if one watches carefully, the breathing very much gets affected in odd ways. One of the benefits of being able to be connected with the sensations of the body is one can begin to see a little further out the changes in one's breathing, the changes in what's occurring through the body. I'll leave that there, as there is much in that aspect, and particularly with the elimination functions of all of these three things. But they're important. And the reason why they're important is that as the soul hopefully forms in a healthy way, I need to understand that the eliminations, the removing things from myself, is just as important as the ingestion. Otherwise, and I've certainly seen this in myself and others, if that there is too much coming in without the requisite elimination of something going out, it can make you implode or explode, literally. Okay. So this is the nutritional waste product aspects, if you'd like, of this formation. There are many ways to look at it, and certainly Gurdjieff does, but this hopefully gives a bit of a grounding that there is a process that occurs in each of us, and that we need to maybe understand, particularly, that we're more than just the body. And what are the requisite needs for these other parts of myself? And to know how to feed it, and also to know how to begin to help remove some of the pollutants. With that, let's just branch out to the macro scale, that there is what Gurdjieff could call a normal human life cycle of soul formation. So when I say normal human, this is a human that is at least in the conditions or an environment that allows soul formation. There are other environments that may not allow it. So, this first phase, this conceptual phase, is relatively straightforward. At conception, according to Gurdjieff, there is a coalescence of potentiality. Now, it's interesting. There's a lot of language in science that talks about emergence. A human emerges from an embryo. This is very slippery and, in my view, very dangerous language. Something in potential, though, is something that can grow into its possibilities. It may not. It may not actualize any of them. But emergence seems to have a bottom-up sense. It kind of doesn't require the actions of something higher. Something in potential, though, a field of potential that something can grow into, means that there is some kind of higher supportive action that may allow this emergence to be fully formed in a field of potential. I just wanted to labour on that. So we have this potentiality at conception. It's one of those things, you know, when you look at the death of, say, a child, as opposed to someone who's elderly, we generally have a bit more of a reaction that there is a greater sense of loss with the child because they've lost their potential, or at least the ability to actualize it. With someone who's a lot older, well, they've already actualized the potential that they're going to. So maybe it's not as such of a loss. So this is kind of ingrained in our language, in that common wisdom. I harp on it only because it's important that right from conception, there is a more holistic sense of what it means to be human. And then, of course, from conception onwards, there's this literal explosion of life. In physiological terms, the embryo goes from a single cell to something that starts to look like a semi-human in a couple of months, which is analogous to a basketball being blown up to the size of the earth in the same period of time. That's extraordinary. Extraordinary amount of growth. Then with birth, somewhere 9 months or so later from conception, it literally initiates or inaugurates the transition from one world to another. The baby takes its first breath. The middle part of the soul now is well and truly initiated. That's interesting. And that first breath ends up being important for a whole host of reasons. But that's its first entry. Its first impression is breath. And according to Gurdjieff, there's this maturation process, and that's just used in its normal way, from roughly birth to 18, 21 years. In more ancient times, that was lower. You were considered a man and a woman, or an adult, a lot younger than that, generally just after puberty. But in modern life, Gurdjieff says roughly then. And with a normal person, hopefully, there should have already been informed in oneself this sense of I. That is, this sense that I'm not my functions. I'm not my thinking, I'm not my emotions, I'm not my body, I'm something else. I may not know what that is, but I have a sense that there's something else here. Unfortunately, in modern life, most people never reach that stage, or if they do, it's much later in life. But this maturation phase is all about the development of functions. Running, jumping, thinking, puzzle solving, all of those sorts of things. Something that stretches us, that pushes us out into the world. And then we have the active life from 1821 through to roughly retirement. Not always, it can be a little bit earlier or a little bit later, which focuses on the development of will, which in modern language is choice making and living with the consequences of those choices. Can I persist? Can I have conviction? All of those things which in ancient times were very important and probably even more important now. But now in our modern world, it seems as though it's a virtue to flip and flop. It's a virtue to do 180, but to really stick with something and to make choices and to bear the consequences. This begins to exercise the will, firms up this I, and helps to begin to feed and crystallize these various parts of the soul. And then from retirement, which is generally roughly 60 to 65 until death, Retirement is not just a passive removing oneself from life, but it is to be able to reduce one's engagement with life so one can increase and be more active in the inner life, to be able to coalesce and help support the development of being, and particularly the higher part of the soul, which in normal terms is what we would call contemplation, worship, some of the mystical arts. But there is a real sense that some of the things in life have been accomplished, and I now need to have a much more active inner search that allows me to connect and relate in ways that will prepare me for what's next. And then the last phase is death, which I'll just hint on. But the first death really starts when there is a cessation of breath, even though there's many definitions of when death actually occurs, which has changed over time depending upon the advancements of medical science. But if there has something that has been formed in this life, there's a potential for it to assist this moving over or a continuation in some way, shape or form, both as it relates to this first death and the second death, as Gurdjieff talks about. But what comes afterwards is very difficult to talk about because we can't even imagine it, because it is the life, the breath, the actions of these middle and higher parts of the soul which have been confined into the lower part so that they can form and are now potentially set free. What does that mean? Well, that's interesting. But one can get a bit of a taste of that through exercises such as, for example, looking at how I sleep and how I wake up, even how I normally sleep and how I normally wake up can give a bit of a taste of what that might mean. Is there any questions there? Okay. So with all of that, what's sex? And I don't just mean the act of sex. I mean this whole energy that sits around sex. Well, for Gurdjieff, sex energy, creative energy, comes from a very high place. Is Exiohari. It powers all of life, gives life to life. And in humans has broadly three essential purposes. Self-creation, growth of the soul, that this energy can be used to support this growth consciously. Procreation, which is the production of children, or other words, soul creation outside of oneself. That as parents, you participate in the birthing of another soul, or at least the potential for one, as well as also helps with the continuance of the species, which is the first obligation in one sense for a human. Whether one has children or one helps support the development of children, this continuance of the species is vital. And what we've already touched on is that the third essential purpose is this healthy elimination of unused substances from self-creation and procreation. Just as an interesting side point, what we would call orgasm, and I hope that everyone here has had one, or maybe more, is that that can also be a very interesting exercise of observation. If you take the physiology out of it, That is all of the arousal component and what happens inside the body and all of that. And you come to the preparation of that experience and the experience itself at the height of orgasm. There can be some very paradoxical experiences. There are many of them, but just some. That in that moment I can be fully present, fully here, and yet I'm not myself. I'm free in a way that is very hard to put into words. I'm also completely relaxed. Indeed, it's a prerequisite that I need to have some level of relaxedness, but also fully engaged and very active. And yet I can be myself, and you almost feel as though I can merge with another. There are more, but it's very interesting what this can come to. And for most people, it's about as close to an spiritual experience as they get, which is probably maybe in a way explains our addiction often to sex, that we're hunting for that experience. We are hunting for that freedom. Everything else leading up to it is a ritual or a process in order to get there. Just one aspect to it. I'm sure there are others. However, there is also a great deal of abuse and misuse and waste of sexual energy. So in a sense, if it's not consciously used for producing children or supporting them or dependence or the creation of a soul, inevitably this sex energy has to go somewhere. If we can or able to balance something in us, this very high, very potent energy can find its place. It can find its home and support this formation of a soul. If there's something that has gone awry in me or is lopsided or unbalanced, this energy has to find its way anyway. It will come out of us in some way, shape, or form because it can't be stopped. It's like a tap. Once turned on, and it's turned on at conception, it is constantly finding a way through us, constantly finding a way to be expressed. So we can't stop it. All we can do is hopefully provide a home for it. If it ends up being misused or wasted, it generally goes into a lot of dominating, conquering, and competing behaviours. This is all born from the ego of self-importance, of self-preservation. If it can't go into the yearnings of a soul, then it has to go somewhere, as I said, and likely goes into the ego. This fuels violence, it fuels warring, it fuels arguments, it fuels generally most of the negative things that we find in relationships. It's where we always get offended. It's where everyone else is wrong and I'm right. Because this energy, while potent and needs to grow into something more fuller, when it is confined in the ego, becomes very small, very shrunken. Some of the examples, as I've said, is vehement intellectual arguing. This is quite common in the intellectual spheres. Everyone trying to be right and proving everyone else is wrong. Strong emotional reactions. Certainly being offended in everything. And bodily fidgeting. When I can't keep still, I'm constantly moving a body part, a leg, an arm, a twitch, a this or a that. So one of the healthy parts about working, for example, with some of the sensing exercises and beginning to be relaxed and supple in the body is that by itself, I'm beginning to consciously engage with allowing this energy to move through me more naturally and not be locked up or blocked inside of the body. So this suppleness, softness is not weakness. It's actually allowing something to move through me. That when I'm tense and all knotted up inside, can't go anywhere. And then it stays there and it festers and it becomes toxic. So this middle and lower parts of the soul. So the body is chrysalis, but this very high energy, this sexual creative energy, which, as I said, can go into many different ways, inevitably ends up being the catalyst to help support something of a higher nature, because it by itself comes from a higher nature. But we generally only observe it in its lower nature expression, that is through the body, through sex or some other thing. So if I'm saying we need to have a healthy respect for this energy that moves through us, we absolutely do. Trying to manipulate it, particularly through drugs or exercises, leads to madness. But what we can do is help prepare the way, help prepare our home, prepare the body, prepare the feelings, prepare the intellect to allow this guest to come in and be. And then it can support everything else. So in a way, I need to stop warring with myself or manipulating and controlling and find a way to begin to serve this energy. Before we move into our last little bit for the exercises, there is a lot there that was quite dense, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key things. Gurdjieff has a lot to say and there's a lot of work just there. But my own view and my own experience, if we could just respect this energy, that would make a world of difference. Any questions, any comments? Okay. So let's come back into our seats. Let's come back into this supportive posture. So when I begin to see myself starting to dissipate, starting to lose something, a quality, my mind racing, that should be a reminding factor. What do I need to do? How can I give myself just a little tiny shock to get things back again? I need to connect with myself. So for this week again, and things will most likely get a bit harder in some respects, a bit easier in other, can I stick with the preparation exercise in the morning? Just connecting with this body. Supple, soft, and alert. And exercise of the observation of fantasy through the body. Can I make myself an aim that when is it abled in me, when I can begin to observe fantasy, whether it's sexual fantasy or any other fantasy? But more importantly, if I can remember to observe this fantasy, how does it affect my body? Even as simple as how does it affect my posture? When I do that and I begin to see it, can I then very actively redirect that energy, my attention, into connecting with the body? So a fantasy pops up. Oh, Luke, how important are you? If only people saw how important and intelligent you are. This fantasy, this inner dialogue of being vain and proud, I see that as a fantasy. Oh, it's a reminder. I see it. I see it how it affects my body. I see how I stand up in myself. I preen my feathers. Can I then use that and go, right, I now need to connect to my body? Can I just take that energy into the body? This will be difficult, but it will also show me something, how strong fantasies are. And then another exercise, if you are able to, this is more of a supplement, is what's called the just enough exercise. The just enough is doing everything just enough. So when I hold my cup of coffee in the morning, can I hold it with my hands so there's just enough tension, just enough to bring it to my mouth? Can I have just enough speed? I don't rush, I don't go so slow, but just enough. When I sip the coffee, can I have just enough so the liquid moves over my tongue, my lips, goes gently down my throat? I'm not trying to gulp. I'm allowing something just enough to move into me. When I walk around the park, can I find just enough that I'm walking with a certain cadence and rhythm that still allows me to be quite relaxed, but yet very firm in my walking? When I'm holding the mouse at my computer, am I holding it with just enough tension? I'm not trying to bury the mouse into my desk, and I'm not trying to wisp it away, but just enough, just enough. And again, like last time, I don't analyze, I don't judge. This is not a performance. You're not on stage. You're not going to get 10 out of 10 or 0 out of 10. Simply, can I see and describe? Where I can, I avoid naming and labeling. Can I just see? Who am I at this moment? What is working in me? What a mystery. So until then, like last week, if we can begin to work at something, though this week I dare say will be very different from last, can I persist? Can I begin to get a sense maybe more fully of this law of heptaparapashanok, this movement in me? The things maybe I might need to keep me on track. Just questions. Just questions. Okay. We've gone a little bit longer than usual, but you've been able to sustain yourselves well. So that's really all, but if there are any questions or anyone wants me to clarify anything, I can do so now, or put it into the chat line through Mighty Networks, and we can just persist at this. But yes, I'm open to being contacted at any point. Questions are good. Questions are good.